Saratoga opens this week and it pays to know what you're getting into. Last year's meet delivered clear patterns on the dirt and turf, both in sprints and routes, that pointed to vulnerable favorites, biases, and places where the public got it wrong. This is about using the numbers and data from last year to know what to watch for from day one in 2025. Be ready to toss closers in dirt sprints at Saratoga. They were 23 for 159 last year. That's a hit rate of just 14%. Early and stalking horses controlled these races. They each won over 40% of the time. There's a slight bias towards the inside post runners, winning 40% of races. That should be looked at with the understanding that these races average 7.42 runners per race. Positioning, though, was important. Look at the average position of winners at the first call. They were in 2.78 place. Comparing that to the average field size of 7.42 runners, it visually paints a picture of how winners were in the top three runners at the first call. Taking it a step forward, they were 1.12 lengths off the lead at that first call. Moving to the second call, they were less than a length off the pace. This is important at Saratoga, where forward speed and positioning is always important. As often as people dub this meet Chalktoga, favorites didn't perform very well last year in these dirt sprints. Overall, favorites won just 30% of races. These spots came down to being able to eliminate the first or second choice in the betting to find value. With the average field size of being just those 7.42 runners per race, this could be the case again this year. The glaring stat is favorites at 3-2 or lower. They won just 35% of the time. That was a big advantage to exploit since they were taking up so much of the win pool. That's going to be important to watch for this year again, especially for exacta players, because they placed 63% of the time. Even better for the betting were favorites in the 8 to 5 to 2 to 1 range. They won 26% of the time. Sliding over to second choices, they won 24% of the races and at better odds. Again, that's in line with looking to eliminate one of the top two choices to find some value in these races. Maiden special weight races were tough for favorites sprinting. Overall, they did win 29% of the time. There's two types of favorites to look at in these maiden special weight races, though. First will be favorites at 3-2 or lower. They won an average 33% of the time and placed 67% of the time. That win and place percentage is in line with the overall profile of these runners. Looking at the balanced favorites in that 8 to 5 to 2 to 1 range, they were 4 for 20, winning 20% of the time. That's important because of how many races are flooded with first time starters. Favorites in these maiden races that aren't being heavily backed could be good to go against. Looking at the stakes races was interesting too. Favorites went 6 for 21. That was below the average overall win percentage of favorites. They still were factors in the exacta though, considering they placed 9 more times. The kicker is that when facing a field of 8 or more runners, favorites won just 26% of races. They placed 51% of the time, which is right in line statistically. Looking at the heavily backed favorites against these fields at 3-2 or lower, they went 8 for 31, winning 25% of the races. The same goes for 8 to 5 to 2 to 1 range favorites. They won 26% of races. Point being, fuller fields look to find the favorite vulnerable in the win slot and beat them. Posts 1 through 3 had a clear advantage last year in the mile races at Saratoga. Remember, these races do start in that first turn, so post positioning is important to save ground. And you see that with posts 1 through 3 winning 60% of races last year. They had 16 more wins than posts 4 through 6. Forwardly positioned runners had the edge here, and you see that with 25 early runners and 22 stalking runners win. Closers struggled just like in the dirt sprints. Looking at the average positioning and beaten lengths of winners helps show how important running styles were. At each call, the average winner was one of the first 3 runners in the race. Further into the race, the more important it was to be in touch with the early speed. Focusing on the 6 furlong call, look at the average positioning of 2.22 place and 0.38 lengths off the leader. Horses were not making up ground to stretch in these mile races. Overall, these mile races were pretty even when looking at it from a betting perspective. Favorites won 37.9% of the time, and second choices were behind them with a 20.7% clip. Looking at the breakdown, heavy favorites won over half the time. That wasn't the place to look to beat them. Going to the favorites in the 8 to 5 to 2 to 1 range, that was where to tackle them. They won just 19% of races. That's a good spot for anyone to take down a favorite since the other options are at better odds. You see the second and third betting choices won and placed more than the favorites in this range. Again, a good spot this year to look to beat shaky or vulnerable favorites. When looking at fields with 8 or more runners, balanced favorites went 2 for 11. On the other end, heavy favorites went 5 for 8. Favorites in maiden special weight races performed well. They won 5 of 11 races and races that were heavily backed at 3 to 2 or lower, they went 3 for 3. But again, balanced favorites were the spot to play against them in this small sample size. The dirt route post positions need to be analyzed closely when factoring in the average field size. There were just 6.13 runners per race. That 3-win difference between posts 1 through 3 and 4 through 6 isn't as significant. I'd focus more on running styles here. As expected, closers accounted for the fewest number of wins. With that being said, they weren't that far off the earlies and stalkers. Of the 9 closers that won, 3 of them were favorites, 2 of them at odds at 3 to 5, and the other was 7 to 5. Dirt racing is all about not being too far off the pace. This trim is important at the mile and 1/8 distance. Early and stalking runners won 40% of the races at this distance each. That's a slight bump up from the overall profile since the mile and 1/4 races were even across the board in the running styles. Pretty fair betting overall on these dirt routes last year at Saratoga. Favorites won at the universal average of 33.3%. You'll see that the third choices actually won more than the second choices, and that reinforces how important it is to find one of the top 2 choices vulnerable before getting into a race here. Going to the breakdown of each class of favorite, races with a favorite at 3 to 2 or lower were the races you faced the most last year, and that should be expected again this year with the smaller fields these races draw. The positive is that in 2024, these favorites were beatable, winning just 38.5% of races. As expected, they placed at a high rate and demand that you have a true opinion before tossing them from win contention. The same trend of third choices outperforming second choices was in this grouping too. Looking at the favorites 8 to 5 to 2 to 1, these were the places to look for vulnerable or underlaid favorites. Third choices had the most wins when facing this betting board. More importantly, look at the second and third choices. They placed 5 times. That should be important to exacta players again this year and to see if this trend continues in 2025. You'll face plenty of stakes races at this distance. Last year, favorites went 4 for 11. 3 of them won at odds at 3 to 2 or lower. They also placed an additional 4 times. Third choices, they won 4 stakes races, and that beat out the 2 that won as second choice in the betting. In fields of 7 or fewer runners, the favorites went 11 for 29. That's a 37.9% clip, and that's higher than the overall win percentage. Going to races with 8 or more runners, favorites went 2 for 10. This situation comes up rarely, but be ready to look for options outside of the favorite in these fuller fields. 13 to 20 early winners sprinting on the turf came in the second month of racing at Saratoga last year. The logical thought process would be simple track evolution with the summer heat coming into play. That can happen on the Saratoga turf very easily. In the first month of racing last year, closers were winning 43% of races. This year, it's going to be important to be ready to watch for if and when this turf course shifts, especially if we're dealing with a very dry summer where the turf can get sped up and hurt anyone who's not near the pace. Speaking of which, look at the average positioning and beaten lengths of winners in these races. Winners, on average, were in the front half of the field, actually a little further forward at each call. Regardless, factoring in the 8.94 runners per race shows visually how winners were forward to mid-pack runners. As a whole, this is a percentage breakdown you'd expect to see. There isn't much to draw from looking at this. Betting in the turf sprints was much clearer where to take your shots when looking at the breakdown versus the overall stats. Heavily backed favorites won 50% of the time, and they placed 3 more times. 14 of the 16 races were won by one of the top 3 choices, and that solidifies how accurate the public was in these races. Sliding down to favorites in the 8 to 5 to 2 to 1 range, that was your best shot to beat them. 7 favorites won, 4 second choices won, and 3 third choices won. These are percentages in your favor if your handicapping and analysis are solid. Look at the favorites 5 to 2 or higher. They struggled as expected. The rule of thumb is to look for prices when facing these cold favorites, and the number supports that when looking at the stats in 2024. Last year, there were 18 maiden special weight races, 9 of which were won by favorites. They placed 12 times. The money was right a lot in these races. Favorites at 3 to 2 or lower, they won 5 of 7 races and placed in all 7. There were 8 allowance races in 2024, and favorites won just 2 of them. Point being, look for overlays in these turf sprints since the fields are fuller. Off-the-pace runners controlled these turf routes last year at Saratoga. You'll see 13 stalkers and 12 closers win a collective 25 of 30 races. Early runners struggled. This profile looks to be fairly even running in the post positions, but don't overlook what many others might. There's a sneaky bias that appeared last year and one to watch out again for this year in 2025 at Saratoga. Posts 7 and deeper in the mile and 16th races won 48% of the time. On the surface, you see that favorites won 30% of turf routes. That's a good percentage as a bettor. You'll also see second and third choices were just behind the favorite in these races. Looking at the betting breakdown, you'll see how favorites won just 30% of the time. Let's start with which favorite performed the best. Down here with favorites at 5-2 or higher, they went 3 for 9. Then moving up to favorites at 3-2 or lower, they were right around the average of 30.8%. Balanced price favorites won 28.6% of the time. Regardless, looking for reasons to beat the favorite in 2024 in these races was a smart move, and that's going to be important to watch for again this year in 2025 at Saratoga. When looking at races with 7 or fewer runners, favorites went 1 for 9, but they placed 7 times. Second and third choices each won 3 races against these short fields. Races with 8 or more runners had a higher strike rate for favorites. They won 38% of the time. Their 8 wins outperformed the second and third choices, who each had only 3 wins when facing these fuller fields. This supports how looking for horses with more upside than the logicals is how you should probably attack these turf routes if the favorite is vulnerable in your handicapping. Inner turf routes favored closers last year, but they too need to be broken down by distance to see the more significant bias that was in play. Looking at the mile and 16th races, closers won 54% of the time. That's bigger than the overall 49% on the profile for this Saratoga inner turf. You also see at this distance how even the post positioning played. Handicapping was fairly straightforward in these races. Project the pace and find who could come from off those fractions to win. The inner turf routes were some of the best races to bet. You see that favorites won a respectable 31.4% of races, but look at the small number of winners who were the second and third choice compared to the rest of the field. 34.3% of races were won by horses who weren't the first, second, or third betting choice. That's a significant edge to look to attack over an entire meet. Looking at the breakdown of favorites, this got even better. First off, these monster favorites won just 26.1% of races. These favorites are usually very logical and hard to get around, especially at a short price. In 2024, they were vulnerable in the win position more than they should have been. You see the big difference between winning and placing of these favorites. Your edge was when facing a balanced or chaos betting board. The balanced favorites won more than the average for the inner turf routes, but look at the 20 chaos races that would produce big prices to target since the favorite is at 5-2 or higher. These favorites, they went just 6 for 20. Combining the balanced and chaos races is also interesting because 64% of the time these races produced a winner that wasn't one of the top 3 betting choices. That's a significant edge for you to attack. It's also double the overall average of winners for the rest of the field. Going to races with 7 or fewer runners, looking to beat the favorite was a tall task. They won 8 of 14 races and placed 13 times. The favorites were very much alive and the money was right in these races. Second choices won 3 times and placed 7. Again, the money was right in these short fields with 7 or fewer runners. Going to races with 8 or more horses were where you should focus your betting dollars. Favorites were 15 for 57, winning 26.3% of the time. They placed 45.6% of the time too. Again, big for exactive players when finding a favorite your handicapping says is false. Attacking these races could give great opportunity to get overpaid when eliminating the favorite. Going into the 2025 Saratoga meet, look to attack races with the favorite 8-5 or higher when facing 8 or more runners in the race. Last year, they proved to be the most profitable to bettors who found value outside the top 3 betting choices. If that trend continues again this year, you should have a profitable summer ahead. Last year's stats don't just tell you what happened, they tell you where the value might be this year, whether you're betting the win, exactas, horizontals. These trends are your first edge of the season at Saratoga in 2025. Get signed up down below in the pinned link in the comments to Substack. Weekly, we're going to be going over this Saratoga track and what biases and betting edges to look to exploit in the weeks to come.